You know that feeling of being on top of the world, running a billion-dollar empire, making decisions that move entire markets, and yet feeling completely lost. That was Aurora Navarro's reality. 3 in the morning, alone on the 42nd floor of the Obsidian Tower, surrounded by glowing screens filled with numbers that meant fortunes being made and destroyed every second. She was the youngest, most powerful CEO in the financial world. Her face on magazine covers, her name on invitations to dinners with presidents and celebrities. But that night, staring out at the city lights below, Aurora felt exhausted, hollow, and, let's be honest, a little too arrogant for her own good. That's when she saw the janitor, the man in the navy blue uniform who cleaned the hallways every night, invisible as a ghost, always with his head down and his headphones hanging around his neck. And Aurora, in a moment she couldn't quite explain. Maybe exhaustion, maybe loneliness, or maybe just that strange need to feel superior to someone, asked a question that would change everything. If you were me, what would you do with $1 billion in a collapsing market? It was meant to be a joke. Provocation. The kind of thing the elite says when they want to amuse themselves at someone else's expense. But what the janitor said back wasn't funny, it wasn't submissive, and it was definitely not what Aurora expected to hear. Those who run before the crash trip first. The market doesn't collapse, ma'am, it just exposes those who are already weak. The words hit like a hammer. Aurora stood there, speechless, while the janitor simply returned to his cleaning cart and walked down the hallway as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Because in that instant, in that simple yet devastatingly precise sentence, Aurora realized 2 things. First, that man was no ordinary janitor, and second, she was about to uncover a truth that would shake her empire to its core. Hours later, Aurora stumbled upon a suspicious report buried under stacks of documents. The Cerberus Protocol, signed by the man she trusted most. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Her advisor of 15 years, the man who had been like an uncle to her, was secretly selling her company to the most ruthless predator in the financial world. But here's the twist no one saw coming. That janitor who gave her that chilling piece of advice. He wasn't just a man who scrubbed floors. He was Miguel Lira, a former financial analyst, once brilliant, now fallen, who had lost everything and was working in the shadows, invisible, yet still able to see patterns no one else could. And in the days that followed, this powerful CEO and this invisible janitor would have to join forces to stop a conspiracy that could destroy not just one company, but the entire market itself. Because this isn't just a story about money or power. It's about what happens when you finally stop looking only upward, at the people who seem important, and start seeing those who truly hold everything together. It's about realizing that salvation doesn't always come from where you expect it. Sometimes it comes from a man in a navy blue uniform you've ignored for 5 years. Sometimes it comes from someone the world decided was invisible, but who actually saw things more clearly than any executive in an Italian suit. And this story will make you question everything you think you know about success, leadership, and who really matters. So stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see the world around you. But before we dive in, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories like this one, and hit like, because every click tells me that this kind of story truly makes a difference for you. And in the comments, tell me, where are you watching from? Which city? Which country? I want to know the amazing people who are here with me on this journey. Now let's dive into the story that starts with a sarcastic question and ends with an empire saved by someone no one thought mattered. The Obsidian Tower never slept. It never had, and maybe it never would. That colossal structure of glass and steel, driven deep into the financial heart of the city like a blade into the earth, pulsed 24 hours a day with the restless rhythm of money that never stops moving. By day, it was a hive of Italian suits, designer heels, and inflated speeches about mergers, acquisitions, and future markets. But at night, oh, at night, it revealed its true face. The spotlights outside cut through the darkness like lost beacons in the ocean, and the upper floors gleamed with that cold, distant light that only billion-dollar power can afford. It was in this setting, in this theater devoid of applause, that Miguel Lira lived his invisible routine. He arrived through the basement at 10 each night, changed his worn-out clothes for a navy blue uniform that smelled of industrial soap, and began his silent dance through the empty corridors. He wasn't just a janitor. He was the ghost who wiped away the footprints of giants, the man who knew every corner of that empire yet had never once been invited to sit at the table. And maybe, deep down, he preferred it that way. Because being invisible was also a kind of protection. Miguel was 42, but the weight on his shoulders suggested 60. The lines on his face didn't come from age, they came from years of worry, each wrinkle a story he'd never told. His gray hair, cut short by his own hand in a foggy bathroom mirror, bore witness to nights of little sleep. His calloused hands gripped the mop with the same precision with which, years ago, they held financial risk models and market reports. Because Miguel hadn't always been a janitor, he had been someone important. A brilliant analyst who could read the patterns of financial chaos as if they were musical scores. But life, in its cruel irony, takes little to turn a stage into an audience. One mistake, one bad bet, one moment of weakness, and suddenly, the man who once directed the symphony was cleaning the concert hall after the show. Now, he was just the man who mopped the offices where others made the decisions he used to make. And while wiping down those polished mahogany desks, Miguel observed, he noticed the graphs left glowing on computer screens, the passwords scribbled on sticky notes, the behavioral rhythms of executives who thought no one was watching. Not out of curiosity, but because his mind had never stopped calculating, predicting, mapping. It was like breathing, impossible to turn off. Miguel's motivation was simple and devastating. Leah, his 9-year-old daughter, with her enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold all the innocence the world hadn't yet stolen. She suffered from a rare, unpronounceable genetic condition that slowly attacked her nervous system, day after day. The experimental treatment cost more than Miguel could make in 10 lifetimes as a janitor, yet he refused to give up. Every cent saved, every extra hour worked, every sacrifice, it was all for her. Leah didn't know that her father had once been a financial prodigy. To her, he was just the man who came home after midnight smelling of cleaning supplies, who sat by her bed and told her stories he made up on the spot. Stories about distant kingdoms and unlikely heroes. And maybe that's what kept him alive. The certainty that, in his daughter's eyes, he was still one of those heroes. Even if the rest of the world had forgotten him, even if he had started to forget himself. The Obsidian Tower was his purgatory, and Leah, his only reason to keep crossing it. It was a Tuesday, 3:40 in the morning, when Destiny decided to knock on Aurora Navarro's door. She sat alone on the 42nd floor, in her Italian leather chair that cost more than a small car, staring down at the city like a queen studying an illuminated chessboard. The executive suite was a monument to success. Dark wood-paneled walls, abstract paintings that no one truly understood but everyone praised, and that breathtaking panoramic view designed to remind her, every night, how far she'd climbed. Yet, Aurora didn't see beauty in any of it. She saw numbers, obligations, expectations, the suffocating weight of carrying a last name synonymous with empire. At 37, she had built a reputation for being relentless, visionary, and untouchable. As CEO of Navarro Capital, one of Latin America's largest investment firms, she was the kind of woman featured on magazine covers under headlines like "The Female Force in Finance." But in that sleepless hour, far from flashbulbs and motivational speeches, she was just a woman alone, trying to understand why success felt so hollow when no one was watching. The silence pressed against her chest like a verdict. For the first time in years, Aurora wondered if maybe power wasn't everything she thought it was. That's when she saw him. Miguel Lira was in the hallway, pushing his cleaning cart with the same slow, deliberate posture as always, head slightly bowed, headphones hanging around his neck, movements mechanical and precise. He didn't glance around. He didn't seem to exist for anyone but his work. Aurora felt something stir inside her, a faint pinch of emotion she couldn't quite name. Maybe envy. Envy of the simplicity, of the quiet, of a life without boardrooms or billion-dollar stakes, acting on an impulse she couldn't explain. Maybe exhaustion, maybe pride. She rose and walked to the glass door. "Hey," she called out, her voice echoing down the long corridor. Miguel stopped, surprised. He wasn't used to being noticed by anyone above the 23rd floor. "How long have you worked here?" Aurora asked, more out of curiosity than kindness. 5 years, ma'am," he answered, formal and distant, the way people do when they know their place in the hierarchy. An awkward silence hung between them. Aurora crossed her arms, tilted her head, and, whether from fatigue, loneliness, or arrogance, asked, "If you were me, what would you do with $1 billion in a collapsing market?" It was a joke, a provocation, the kind of thing the powerful say to amuse themselves when they want to feel untouchable. But what came back wasn't a nervous laugh or a humble cliché. It was something else entirely. Miguel looked at her, really looked at her, and when he finally spoke, his words cut through the air like a blade. "Those who run before the crash trip first," he said quietly. "The market doesn't collapse, ma'am. It just exposes the ones who are already weak." The sentence landed like thunder, not violent, but sharp enough to wake her up. It stung her pride and sparked her curiosity all at once. Aurora stood frozen, speechless, while Miguel calmly went back to pushing his cart, vanishing into the end of the hallway as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. His words echoed inside her mind like a silent alarm, unsettling, relentless. She walked back to her office with a strange heaviness in her chest. When she sat down, her eyes fell on a stack of reports scattered across her desk. One document caught her attention, a technical report she hadn't bothered to read earlier. Cerberus Protocol, Strategic Merger Analysis, dry, boring, routine. Signed by Ottavio Brandão, her most trusted advisor of over a decade. She picked it up almost without thinking, flipped through a few pages, and then stopped. Something was wrong. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't loud, but it was there, hidden between the lines, like a faint discord in a perfect symphony. Aurora felt her stomach twist. She wasn't sure if it was fear or intuition, but her pulse quickened. And in that vast, silent office, surrounded by symbols of everything she had built, Aurora realized something that made her skin crawl. The call to adventure doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes, it comes from the quiet, stubborn voice inside, the one that whispers, "You need to see what you've been refusing to see." Aurora spent the next 3 days trying to convince herself she was losing her mind. Because that had to be it, right? Paranoia, sleep deprivation, the inevitable side effect of surviving on 4 hours of rest, a dozen espressos a day, and an endless stream of meetings that blurred one into the next. She shoved the Cerberus Protocol report into a drawer and swore she wouldn't think about it again. After all, Ottavio Brandão was practically family. He'd been her father's right hand, the man who stood beside her at the funeral, who held her hand the night she took over the company at 32, young, terrified, and utterly unprepared. Ottavio was loyalty in a gray suit and silk tie. It didn't make sense to doubt him. It didn't make sense to doubt anyone. And yet, the janitor's words wouldn't leave her head. The market doesn't collapse, it just exposes the ones who were already weak. Every time Aurora closed her eyes, she saw the report, those numbers that didn't quite fit, those legal clauses that sounded like riddles, those patterns that whispered instead of spoke. She tried to drown it out. She scheduled investor dinners, joined panels on corporate governance, even agreed to an interview for a glossy business magazine. But deep down, where no camera or headline could reach, Aurora knew she was running. And worse, she knew she was afraid. Afraid of what exactly? afraid of finding out she was right, afraid of opening Pandora's box and watching her empire crumble from the inside. Afraid to admit that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as brilliant as everyone believed. And most of all, afraid that her father's legacy, the Navarro name, that heavy crown of steel and expectation, would be tarnished by her mistake. Aurora Navarro couldn't afford mistakes. The corporate world didn't forgive women who stumbled. They had to be perfect, precise, 3 moves ahead at all times. If she started questioning Ottavio, if she triggered an internal investigation, if the board caught even a whiff of scandal, the market would smell blood in the water. Stocks would plummet, investors would scatter, and Cesar Varela, that vulture of a man who'd been circling her company for months with increasingly aggressive merger proposals, would finally get his perfect excuse to strike. So Aurora did what she did best. She compartmentalized. She chose denial. She told herself it was nothing, that the report was just another tedious financial document in a world built on tedious financial documents. She locked the drawer. She avoided the 42nd floor after midnight. And, above all, she avoided the janitor, the man with the quiet eyes and the unsettling wisdom, who had somehow cracked something open inside her that she wasn't ready to face. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Miguel Lira was fighting his own ghosts. He hadn't meant to speak. He hadn't meant to break his silence. For 5 years, he'd perfected the art of invisibility, exactly as he needed to. But that night, when Aurora asked that arrogant, careless question, the kind of question only the powerful ever ask, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was anger at the hypocrisy of brilliance masking incompetence. Or maybe it was just memory, the echo of the man he used to be. The one who saw patterns in chaos and meaning in noise. Now he regretted it, every word, because he knew what happened to people like him when they spoke out of turn. He'd seen this movie before, and it never ended well. He'd already been cast out once from a world that doesn't forgive those who see too much. Every night, he looked at Leah, sleeping with her worn-out teddy bear in her arms, and thought, I can't lose this job. I can't risk it. I can't care. But conscience is a cruel companion. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't keep quiet. And Miguel knew, with that deep, unshakable certainty carved by experience, that something was very, very wrong inside that tower. He'd seen the signs. The new executives appearing on restricted floors. The shredded documents disposed of at odd hours. The abrupt silences when he passed through the corridors, and that one report he'd seen left in the printer at 3 in the morning, stamped top secret, in still wet ink. That wasn't normal. None of it was. But what could he do? He was just a janitor, a ghost, a nobody. And ghosts don't save empires. They just watch silently as everything begins to fall apart. Aurora needed someone she could trust. Someone outside the eye of the storm. Someone who could look at that cursed report and tell her whether she was seeing ghosts or if the danger was real. There was only one person who fit that description. Beatriz Salles. Beatriz had served on Navarro Capital's board for nearly 15 years before retiring 2 years earlier to, as she put it, tend orchids and my sanity. Her hair was white and cut into a flawless bob. She wore red-framed glasses that contrasted with sober suits, and she spoke in a slow, surgical way that made liars sweat. Beatrice was a corporate lawyer, an expert in hostile takeovers and restructurings, and she had a reputation for incorruptibility, an attribute in finance as rare as a blue diamond. Aurora arranged a discreet lunch at a Japanese restaurant on the other side of town, away from the market's curious eyes. By the time they sat, Beatrice already knew something was wrong. You look like someone who just discovered the floor's fake, she said, picking up the menu while keeping her eyes on Aurora. Tell me, no circumnavigation. Aurora slid a copy of the Cerberus Protocol across the table. Beatrice adjusted her glasses and began to read, turning the pages with the calmness of someone dissecting a live organism. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Aurora toyed with the sake without drinking, her fingers nervously tapping the rim of the cup. After 20 minutes, 20 eternal minutes, Beatrice closed the document, removed her glasses, and exhaled slowly. "This," she said, tapping the cover with her index finger, "is a Trojan horse, and whoever built it knows your company inside out." Aurora felt her stomach drop. "Explain it to me like I'm 12, she asked, voice softer than usual. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Aurora with the intensity that only decades of experience produce. "This protocol isn't a merger. It's a disguised transfer of control. Look here, Clause 17, retroactive assignment of assets in case of administrative default. And here, Annex 3, an external audit with veto powers over strategic decisions. Aurora, that means if this merger is signed, Cesar Varela won't become a partner. He becomes the owner. And you become a decorative executive." The words landed like lead. Aurora felt the room tilt. But how? Ottavio reviewed this personally. He would never let something like this pass. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. Exactly. He would never let it pass, unless he wanted it to pass. The silence that followed was dense, almost solid. Aurora didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it. But the pieces began to fit with an alarming clarity. Ottavio's secret meetings, unexplained trips to Zurich, the way he'd pushed, almost forced, her to sign the protocol before the board meeting. "He betrayed me," Aurora murmured, more to herself than to Beatrice. "No," Beatrice corrected, clinical and cold. "He sold you, and Cesar Varela bought you. Now the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Aurora looked at the woman in front of her, the rock who'd steadied her through chaos, and felt something ignite inside. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. "I'm going to destroy this. I'll expose them both. I'll make them regret underestimating me." Beatrice smiled, a small, genuine smile. "That's the Aurora I know, but you'll need proof, solid proof, and you'll need someone who understands systems, tracking, and things lawyers and CEOs don't." Aurora frowned. "Who?" Beatrice shrugged. "I don't know, but you need to find that person, fast, because Cesar won't wait. If he suspects you already, he'll accelerate his attack." The lunch ended with Aurora leaving the restaurant with a clear mission and a knot in her throat. She needed an unlikely ally. Unbeknownst to her, that ally was only a few floors away. Meanwhile, across town, Miguel Lira sat in a shabby corner bar that served greasy snacks and warm beer. Across from him, Jonas Pereira, thin, thick-rimmed glasses, a rough beard, took his third draft and shook his head like someone who'd heard too much nonsense. Jonas had been Miguel's colleague back in the brokerage's golden days before the fall. Now he worked in data security for a tech firm, and he was one of the few people who still treated Miguel as human. "Let me get this straight," Jonas said, wiping foam from his upper lip. "You, a janitor who's supposed to be invisible, gave financial advice to a billionaire CEO? Man, you're asking to get fired." Miguel rolled his eyes. "I know. It wasn't planned. She asked, I answered. And now I can't stop thinking about what I saw." He pulled a napkin and began scribbling numbers, patterns, times. "Something's happening there, Jonas. Strange movements. Documents shredded at odd hours. Meetings at absurd times. And that report I saw, I worked on mergers long enough to know when a clause is wrong. That clause was wrong, badly wrong." Jonas studied the scribbles, his analytical mind processing the data. After a few minutes, he whistled low. "If you're right, it's market manipulation, and if you stick your nose into it and get burned, who takes care of Leah?" The question hit Miguel like a blow. He fell silent, crushed by the weight of responsibility. Jonas sighed and put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Look, I get it. You want to do the right thing. But Miguel, you can't save the world. You tried before and nearly destroyed yourself. Think of your daughter. She needs you alive, not you playing hero." But Miguel knew, and Jonas knew that Miguel knew, that some things can't be turned off. Conscience, intuition. the cursed gift of seeing what others don't. In that shabby bar, with a friend who cared, Miguel Lira made a decision that would change everything. He would use his talent one last time, even if it cost him dearly, because, after all, unlikely heroes rarely have a choice. There are moments in life when you know, with that primal certainty that rises from somewhere deep within your soul, that you are about to cross a line from which there is no return. Aurora Navarro stood before that line on a Thursday night, alone in her office, her hand resting on the mouse, the cursor blinking on the computer screen like a silent heartbeat. What she was about to do was technically legal, but morally gray, and more importantly, irreversible. She was about to authorize a full trace of every internal server in Navarro Capital, emails, transfers, access logs, everything. No board approval, no notification, no protocol. The very same protocol she herself had helped write. If discovered, it could spark an internal investigation, a crisis of trust, maybe even her removal as CEO. But Beatriz Sales had been clear. If you want proof, you have to look where they don't expect you to. And you have to do it before they realize you're looking. Aurora inhaled deeply. She thought of her father, of the legacy she'd built from his shadow, of Otavio Brandão, the man she had once called family, and then, almost involuntarily, she thought of the janitor's voice. The market only exposes those who were already weak. She clicked. The system beeped softly, a digital confirmation that her command had gone through. No fireworks, no drama. Just a small progress icon spinning on the screen, as invisible algorithms began to dig into the buried truths of her empire. Her pulse quickened. Aurora Navarro had just stepped into a different world, the world of hidden loyalties, buried numbers, and truths too dangerous to say out loud. 3 floors below, deep in the bowels of the Obsidian Tower, Miguel Lira was doing the same thing, just in a far more clandestine way. He crouched behind a server rack, an old laptop balanced on his knees, a single Ethernet cable plugged into the auxiliary network line. Jonas Pereira had given him remote access and a handful of data tracing tools. Nothing technically illegal, but certainly not authorized. "You've got 10 minutes before the system flags the anomaly," Jonas had warned over the headset. "After that, they'll know someone's poking around where they shouldn't." Miguel's fingers flew over the keyboard, the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times in another life. He wasn't searching for something specific. He was searching for patterns, irregularities too deliberate to be accidental. And he found them. Backdoor entries logged at strategic hours, encrypted data transfers to Zurich servers, every Tuesday and Thursday, always past midnight. Access logs erased, but not completely, because nothing is ever fully erased when you know where to look. "Jonas, are you seeing this?" he whispered, spinning the laptop to face the webcam. On the other end, Jonas took several long seconds before replying. When he did, his voice had lost its casual tone. "Man, this isn't amateur work. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and had admin-level clearance." Miguel's stomach dropped. "So it's someone inside," Jonas exhaled. "Not someone inside, someone at the top." Miguel yanked the cable, slammed the laptop shut, and left the server room like a man fleeing a fire. His pulse hammered in his ears, his palms slick with sweat. He knew he'd just crossed a line he could never uncross. He was a janitor, a ghost, a nobody. But now, he had information, dangerous information, the kind that could destroy powerful people, or destroy him first. As he climbed the service stairs, he thought of Leah, of her fragile smile, of the promise he'd made to her, that he would stay out of trouble, that he would keep his head down, that he would just work and survive. But then he thought of Aurora Navarro, the woman with the tired eyes who'd once asked him a question meant as mockery, and ended up awakening something in both of them. And in that instant, Miguel realized, with painful clarity, that he and the billionaire CEO were now on the same side of a war neither had asked to fight. They had entered, each from their own path, the same shadow world. And in that world, there was no neutrality. You either fought or you were consumed. When Miguel emerged from the stairwell back into the glowing corridor of the 23rd floor, he knew he wasn't the same man who had gone down an hour earlier. He had crossed the threshold, and beyond it, the storm was already forming. Aurora didn't sleep that night. She stayed up until dawn, watching data stream across her screen in real time. The more she saw, the more her stomach twisted. Encrypted emails between Otavio and shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Secret meetings scheduled with Cesar Varela that had never been logged on the corporate calendar. Transfers of confidential documents to external servers. And worst of all, a hidden annex in the Cerberus protocol, accessible only by a password tied directly to Otavio's account. When the sun finally rose, Aurora Navarro was no longer the woman who had clicked that button the night before. She had seen the truth, raw, undeniable, merciless, and there was no going back. She grabbed the phone and called Beatrice. "You were right," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Otavio sold me out, and I have proof." On the other end, Beatrice's voice was calm, almost surgical. "Then this is where the hard part begins. Proof is one thing, surviving long enough to use it is another." Aurora hung up and turned to the window. The city below was waking, oblivious to the silent wars being waged in its skyscrapers. She felt something she hadn't in years. It wasn't fear, nor anger. It was determination. The cold, lucid determination of someone who knows she's entered a battle she cannot afford to lose. And somewhere in the obsidian tower, an invisible janitor felt exactly the same. The next few days turned into a chaotic ballet of silent movements and unlikely alliances. Aurora had gathered her initial evidence, but Beatrice had been blunt. Digital proof is fragile. It can be challenged, altered, or dismissed on legal technicalities. You need the full trail, bank transfers, signed contracts, witnesses, and you need people you can trust, because from now on, every move you make is being watched. That was how Aurora assembled her small army. Beatrice would be the legal strategist, the mind that planned 3 moves ahead. Camila Prado, her secretary for 6 years, a woman in her 30s, efficient as a Swiss clock and loyal as a guard dog, would become the eyes and ears inside the company. Camila had that rare gift of being invisible when necessary and indispensable when it mattered. She drifted through corridors, jotting down elevator conversations, noting who entered and left meeting rooms. And then there was Miguel. Aurora didn't yet know how he fit into it all. But that phrase, that damn phrase about stumbling before the crash, kept echoing in her mind like a mantra. There was something about that janitor she couldn't ignore. A hidden intelligence, an experience that seeped through his every gesture, even when he tried to make himself small. And more importantly, he had seen something. She didn't know what, but her instinct screamed that Miguel Lira was a crucial piece of the puzzle. On the other side of the board, the enemies were also moving, though they didn't yet know they'd been exposed. Cesar Varela was the alpha wolf, 58 years old, gray hair slicked perfectly back, wearing tailored suits that cost more than imported cars, and flashing that shark-like smile at charity dinners and economic panels. He had built an empire by buying struggling companies, dismantling them piece by piece, and selling off the remains for triple the price. In the market, they called him the Butcher, a nickname he pretended to hate but secretly adored. Cesar didn't want Navarro capital because he needed it, but because he could. Because destroying a family legacy and turning it into profit was the kind of trophy that fed his insatiable ego. And then there was Otavio Brandão, the traitor. The Judas in a gray suit. Otavio was more complex than Cesar. His betrayal wasn't driven solely by greed, but by years of festering resentment. For 15 years, he'd been number 2, the advisor, the right hand, always competent, always present, always overshadowed. When Aurora's father died and she took over the presidency at 32, Otavio felt robbed. "I built this with him," he would think during sleepless nights. And she just inherited it. Cesar's offer had been irresistible. 5 million euros in a Zurich account and an equity stake in the post-merger company. All Otavio had to do was smooth the process. Create the Cerberus protocol. Make sure Aurora signed without reading between the lines, and then sit back and watch from his private balcony as the empire he helped build was dismantled by more deserving hands. The evidence began stacking up like dominoes. Through a favor owed by an accountant, Camilla discovered 3 suspicious transfers sent from Navarro Capital's accounts to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, always approved by Otavio, always classified as strategic consultancy. Beatriz, leveraging her Swiss connections, confirmed that there was a bank account belonging to an offshore entity controlled by Otavio, and that account had received an initial deposit of exactly 2 million euros 3 weeks earlier, 2 days after Cesar and Aurora's first merger meeting. Meanwhile, Miguel continued his quiet detective work. He mapped out the exact times documents were remotely accessed from the company servers, cross-referenced them with the building's entry logs, and discovered that someone had been accessing confidential files from outside the Obsidian Tower, always using Otavio's credentials, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Jonas helped trace the IP, a 5-star hotel in the financial district, registered under a consulting firm based in Luxembourg, a firm that, after much digging, they discovered was secretly owned by Cesar Varela. The pieces fit together with terrifying precision. But time was the real enemy, because while Aurora and her unlikely team gathered evidence, life refused to stop. Leah, Miguel's daughter, had a crisis at school. The tremors had returned, and stronger this time, and the teacher, terrified, called to say the girl had fainted in the middle of math class. Miguel dropped everything, the hidden notebook in the janitor's closet, the investigation, the world, and ran to the hospital. When he arrived, Leah was lying on a stretcher, pale as a ghost, her large brown eyes gazing at him with that fragile mix of fear and trust only a child can hold. "Daddy, I'm tired," she whispered weakly. "I know, sweetheart, I know," he said, gripping her hand so tightly he feared he might break it. The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. The experimental treatment had to start within 48 hours. Or the window of effectiveness would close. The cost, 120,000 Ries up front plus hospital expenses. Miguel had 17,000 saved, 17,000 painstakingly gathered over 5 years. Not even close. He left the hospital with glassy eyes and a tight chest, and that's when the phone rang. It was Jonas. "Miguel, you need to see this. Now." And in that moment, heart shattered, time slipping through his fingers, Miguel Lira realized the battle he had chosen to fight wasn't just about justice or truth, it was personal. Because, in the end, unlikely heroes aren't born from noble intentions. They're born from despair, and Miguel was desperate. Aurora was racing her own clock. Cesar had called an extraordinary board meeting in 48 hours, the exact deadline for signing the Cerberus protocol. "It's now or never," he had said with that predatory smile. "The market's volatile, Aurora. If we don't close this now, the opportunity's gone." It was a calculated pressure, a trap disguised as urgency. And Aurora knew that if she entered that meeting without solid proof, without a plan, without powerful allies, she would be devoured. Otavio, meanwhile, moved through the company with the calm confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He greeted employees, reviewed contracts, even brought flowers to reception for an assistant's birthday. No one suspected a thing, because the best traitors are the ones who look incapable of betrayal. And as he smiled and played the loyal confidant, Aurora watched him from afar, studying every movement, every word, every micro-expression. She was learning a brutal truth. In the corporate world, the worst blows don't come from the outside. They come from within, from the people you trusted most, and that painful lesson was transforming Aurora Navarro from an inherited CEO into a true warrior. 48 hours remained, and the battlefield was set. Beatriz Sales had a saying she repeated whenever someone underestimated the complexity of a corporate war. "The best strike is the one the enemy thinks they landed first." And that was exactly what she and Aurora orchestrated during a secret meeting in a borrowed office, far from the Obsidian Tower, far from curious eyes, far from any chance of surveillance. Only 3 people were present: Aurora, Beatrice, and Camilla. The room smelled of stale coffee and paper, with a scratched wooden table and a window overlooking a dull alley. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would draw attention. Perfect. Beatrice spread documents across the table like someone assembling a macabre puzzle and began explaining the plan with that surgical coldness only decades of legal warfare could forge. "You're going to create a legal trap," she said, adjusting her red glasses. "A reciprocal addendum to the Cerberus Protocol that, on the surface, looks like a simple bureaucratic formality, but in practice, it makes it impossible to transfer controlling interest without the unanimous approval of all original shareholders, including pension funds, minority investors, and even that distant cousin of your father's who owns 0.3% of the shares and lives in Portugal." Aurora frowned, trying to follow the reasoning. "But Cesar will never agree to that. He'll see through it immediately." Beatrice smiled, that thin, dangerous smile of someone always 3 moves ahead. "He won't, because you won't show him the full addendum. You'll show him only the first page, the one that talks about mutual protection of interests and bilateral transparency. Empty, pompous terms. The kind of thing lawyers love and executives ignore. And when he signs it, well, then he'll realize he signed his own cage." Camilla, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward. "And Otavio? He's going to review the document. He always does." It was Aurora who answered, her tone colder now, harder, as if a part of her had solidified overnight. "Otavio will get a different version. It'll look identical, but with subtle changes in the audit clauses. Changes that'll make him think he's protected when, in reality, he's exposed." Beatrice nodded, satisfied. "Exactly. And that's where the second part of the plan comes in. The loyalty test." She slid a thin folder across the table. Inside was a single document, a fake financial report, meticulously crafted, filled with deliberate errors and information that seemed confidential, but was actually bait. "This report will circulate internally," Beatrice explained. "It contains an invisible digital watermark that tracks who opens it, prints it, and forwards it. If Otavio's the leak, he'll bite. He'll send it to Cesar thinking he's delivering gold. And when he does, we'll have undeniable proof of his betrayal." Aurora looked at the document with a mix of admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the genius of the plan. Sorrow because she was about to confirm the betrayal of someone she once called family. "And if he doesn't take the bait?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Then we're screwed," Beatrice replied, blunt as ever. "But he'll bite, because traitors are predictable. They always think they're smarter than they really are." The plan went into motion that very afternoon. Camilla accidentally left the fake report in the printer on the 28th floor, Otavio's floor. The document bore a discreet stamp reading "Confidential, Executive Board Only," and a yellow sticky note with a handwritten message: "Aurora, review before tomorrow's meeting." Irresistible, poison disguised as opportunity. Otavio found the report exactly 42 minutes later. Camilla, casually organizing files in the hallway, saw him pick up the paper, glance around to make sure he was alone, and quickly snap a photo with his phone. He didn't take the original, a clever move from someone who knew that leaving a physical trail was amateurish, but the digital photo that he sent to a cryptic number that Beatrice and Jonas had already mapped. A number registered to a disposable chip bought in Zurich 3 weeks earlier. A number that, according to call logs, had frequent contact with Cesar Varela. When the notification flashed on the tracking system Jonas had built, Miguel, monitoring everything remotely from a rundown cafe 3 blocks from the Obsidian Tower, felt his stomach twist. "He took the bait," Miguel whispered into his earpiece. On the other end, Jonas let out a low whistle. "Son of a bitch. He actually took it." In that moment, All the suspicions, all the instincts, all the scattered puzzle pieces coalesced into one undeniable truth. Ottavio Brandão was the traitor, and now they had proof. Aurora received the confirmation through a secure, encrypted message from Beatriz. The fish bit the hook. We have the timestamp, IP, recipient. It's him. She was alone in her office when she read it. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling something die inside her. It wasn't innocence. She'd lost that long ago. It was the last faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. That Ottavio was innocent. That the man who held her hand at her father's funeral wasn't capable of stabbing her in the back. But reality is merciless, and truth, when it finally emerges, doesn't apologize. Aurora set the phone down, stood up, and walked to the window. The city lights were starting to glow, signaling the end of another day. But for her, something was just beginning. Because now, it wasn't about evidence or legal maneuvers anymore. It was personal, deeply personal. And Aurora Navarro had just learned a lesson her father never taught her. In business, forgiveness may be noble, but victory is necessary. She picked up the phone and called Beatriz. "He took the bait," she said, her voice steady. "I know," Beatriz replied. "Then it's all or nothing. Tomorrow, at the board meeting, you'll do exactly as I told you. You'll hand him the addendum. Stay calm, and let them believe they're winning. And when Cesar signs, we close the cage." Aurora hung up and turned back to the window. Out there, somewhere in the same city, an invisible janitor named Miguel Lira was also staring at the horizon, thinking about the daughter he needed to save and the war he had chosen to fight. Two worlds, two desperations, one battlefield, and the hidden cave, that dark place where secrets are kept and truths are buried, was about to be breached. The extraordinary board meeting was set for 3 o'clock on a rainy Friday afternoon, the kind of São Paulo rain that turned the city into a liquid maze, clogging drains and testing everyone's patience. Aurora arrived at the Obsidian Tower at 2:15, 45 minutes early, because warriors don't arrive late to their own battlefield. She wore a navy blue suit that cost enough to pay 3 months' rent for a decent apartment, heels that added 8 centimeters to her height, and that mask of confidence executives learn to wear like armor. But inside, beneath the expensive fabric and flawless posture, Aurora was terrified, because she knew the next few hours would decide everything. Either she would leave that room as the CEO who saved her father's empire, or as the naive heiress who handed it to a predator on a silver platter. There was no middle ground, no tie. It was victory or destruction. Camilla found her in the hallway, holding a folder with the final documents. "Everything's ready," she whispered. "Beatriz reviewed it 3 times. The addendum's perfect. Cesar won't see it coming." Aurora nodded, trying to calm the drumbeat in her chest. "And Ottavio? He got his version half an hour ago. He's probably already sent it to Cesar, just like we planned." That's when Aurora asked the question that had been tormenting her for hours. "What if it goes wrong, Camilla? What if I'm betting everything on one move, and I lose?" Camilla looked at her with that unshakable loyalty that only years of partnership can forge. "Then we lose together. But at least we won't lose because we stood still." At 2:50, the board members began arriving. 12 people, mostly gray-haired men in dark suits, representing investment funds, minority shareholders, and old friends of the Navarro family. And of course, the 2 protagonists of this high-stakes play, Cesar Varela, entering the room like a boxer already certain of his victory, greeting everyone with that shark-like grin, and Ottavio Brandão, appearing calm, composed, even slightly bored, the perfect performance of a man with nothing to hide. Aurora observed them from a distance, studying every micro-expression, every gesture, every exchanged glance. And in that moment of pure, clinical observation, she noticed something that changed everything. Cesar and Ottavio never looked at each other, not once. No greeting, no acknowledgement, no trace of familiarity. It was too deliberate to be coincidence, It was staged. They were avoiding any visible association because they knew that after the merger, investigations would follow. The fewer visible links between them, the better. Clever, very clever, but not clever enough. The meeting began with the usual formalities: agenda review, approval of previous minutes, quarterly financial reports. Aurora conducted it all with the precision of a maestro, maintaining rhythm, controlling time, waiting for the right moment. And then, finally, the main item arrived: the merger with the Varela Group. Cesar stood to make his presentation. He had that infuriating gift of turning numbers into epic narratives, of making a business deal sound like destiny itself. "We're talking about creating the largest investment conglomerate in Latin America," he declared, pointing at the graphs projected on the screen. "A perfect synergy between tradition and innovation, between the Navarro legacy and the Varela drive. Together, we'll be unstoppable." The board members listened, impressed. Some even applauded, that polite corporate applause that means nothing more than courtesy. Aurora waited for the room to settle before standing. "Cesar, your presentation is, as always, inspiring," she began, her voice steady. "But I'd like to propose an addendum to the Cerberus Protocol, a mutual protection clause that ensures both parties are equally committed to the success of this merger." She gestured to Camilla, who began distributing copies of the document. Cesar took his while, flipped through it briefly, and for a fraction of a second, Aurora saw irritation flicker across his face, but he recovered quickly. "Aurora, with all due respect, we've discussed these terms extensively. Last-minute changes like this could delay the process and scare off investors. Or they could protect both sides from unpleasant surprises," Aurora countered, keeping her tone professional. "It's just a formality, Cesar. If your intentions are truly for a long-term partnership, as you claim, this shouldn't be an issue." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Cesar looked to Ottavio, expecting him to intervene, to find a legal loophole, to save the moment. But Ottavio, the traitor who thought he was protected by his modified version, simply shrugged. "Seems reasonable," he said, digging his own grave without realizing it. "If it's just a formality, as Aurora said, I don't see a problem signing it." Cesar had no choice. Refusing would mean admitting he had something to hide. And in front of 12 witnesses, with lawyers present and minutes being recorded, he couldn't afford to look suspicious. So he smiled, that forced, brittle smile of a man swallowing glass, and said, "Of course, no problem." And he signed. At that moment, Aurora felt a rush of pure adrenaline. Cesar Varela had just signed his own cage, and he didn't even know it. But the ordeal was far from over, because while the meeting continued, 3 floors below, in the basement of the Obsidian Tower, something unexpected was happening. Miguel was in the auxiliary server room, monitoring data traffic as he had done for weeks, when a notification popped up on his screen. An attack, a massive digital assault from outside, targeting Navarro Capital's security systems. "Jonas, you seeing this?" Miguel whispered urgently into his headset. "Yeah," Jonas replied, tension in his voice. "It's Cerberus, the algorithm they planted. It wasn't just a merger protocols, Miguel. It's a weapon, a digital time bomb set to detonate the moment the addendum was signed." Miguel felt the blood freeze in his veins. They knew. Cesar knew Aurora would try something, and he built a backup plan. "Not a backup," Jonas corrected. "A massacre. If that algorithm completes its sequence, it'll crash the servers, erase backups, corrupt financial data, and cause an internal collapse that'll make Navarro Capital look incompetent and unstable. When the market opens Monday morning, the stock will tank, and Cesar will buy everything for 1/10 of the price." Miguel stared at the screen, watching the malicious code multiply like a virus in a bloodstream. And then he remembered. Years ago, when he was still an analyst, he'd helped design the architecture of that very system, and had left something hidden, a backdoor, a kill switch only he knew existed, because Miguel Lira had always been the kind of man who planned for the worst-case scenario. He hadn't known back then that one day he'd need it, but fate is funny that way. It prepares you for battles you don't yet know you'll have to fight. "Jonas, I can stop this," Miguel said, his fingers already flying over the keyboard. "But it'll burn my identity. They'll know someone from the inside interfered. They'll trace it back to me." "Then don't," Jonas said flatly. "Let the company fall. It's not your problem, Miguel. Think about Leah." And that's when Miguel Lira made the hardest decision of his life. He thought about Leah, about the treatment she needed, about the promise he'd made to stay out of trouble. Then he thought about Aurora Navarro, about the woman who had looked at him as if he were visible, who had asked a sharp question and gotten an honest answer. And Miguel realized that, in the end, heroes don't choose convenient battles. They choose necessary ones. "Damn," he muttered, and he hit the kill switch. What happened in the next 5 minutes was the kind of silent chaos only someone fluent in technology could fully appreciate. On the basement screens, Miguel watched the Cerberus algorithm, that 3-headed digital beast designed to devour Navarro Capital from the inside out, start to stutter, glitch, falter. It was like watching a predator mid-sprint suddenly trip over its own paws. The kill switch Miguel had built years ago was elegant in its simplicity, a recursive loop that forced the system to endlessly verify its own integrity, consuming all processing power until every malicious process froze. It didn't destroy anything permanently, but it jammed the machine long enough for the threat to die. "It worked," Jonas whispered on the other end of the line, his voice laced with disbelief. "Holy shit, Miguel, it worked." But Miguel didn't celebrate, because he knew what came next. He knew the system logs would reveal someone had intervened. He knew an investigation would follow. And he knew, sooner or later, the trail would lead straight to him. The invisible janitor had just made himself visible, and there was no going back. 3 floors above, in the boardroom, Aurora was in the middle of explaining quarterly growth projections when her phone buzzed. A message from Beatrice. Short, sharp, urgent. "Attack neutralized. We have an unlikely hero. End the meeting. Now." Aurora frowned, puzzled, but trusted her instincts. She cut her sentence in half, looked at the board members, and said with an authority that brooked no argument, "Gentlemen, I'd like to call a 15-minute recess. There's an urgent matter I need to verify before we proceed." Cesar began to protest. "Aurora, we're in the middle of a critical deliberation. This is highly irregular." But she was already standing, already walking out, already ignoring the voices calling her back. Camilla followed close behind, heels clicking against the marble floor. "What happened?" she asked, breathless. "I don't know," Aurora answered, pressing the button for the basement with a force that made the metal vibrate. "But something changed, and I need to find out what." When the elevator doors opened, they found Miguel Lira sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, his laptop still open on his lap, his face drained with exhaustion. He looked up when he saw them, and for the first time in 5 years, Aurora and Miguel truly saw each other. Not as CEO and janitor, not as visible and invisible, but as 2 people who had just survived the same shipwreck. "It was you," Aurora said. It wasn't a question, it was a truth. Miguel nodded slowly, the movement heavy, honest. "It was. And now you have to decide what to do with me." Aurora stepped closer. Camilla stood back, watching the moment unfold, confusion and awe mingling in her eyes. "What did you do exactly?" Aurora asked, her voice steady but low, and so Miguel told her. About the Cerberus algorithm, the digital attack that had been set to trigger the moment the addendum was signed, and the kill switch he'd designed years ago when he was still a risk analyst. "I built the security architecture of this company 8 years ago," Miguel explained, voice hoarse. "Back when I was still someone, when I still had a name that mattered. And I always left a back door, not out of malice, but because I knew systems fail, and someone needs to have the key to fix them when they do." Aurora stared at him, processing. "You're not a janitor." I've been a janitor for 5 years, Miguel corrected. Before that, I was Miguel Lira, quantitative analyst, risk algorithms specialist, until I bet wrong, lost everything, and the market spat me out like I never existed. Silence filled the corridor, heavy, human. Aurora sank to the floor beside him, a gesture so unexpected, so far from corporate decorum, that Camilla nearly stepped forward to stop her. But she didn't. She understood she was witnessing something important. "Why did you help me?" Aurora asked, looking at the man who had just saved her empire. "Because you asked me what I would do," Miguel said simply. "And no one's asked me anything in 5 years. No one's seen me in 5 years. But you did. Even if it was sarcastic, even if it was just for a second, you saw me." And that was when Aurora understood. She understood that the empire she led, that glass and steel tower reaching into the clouds, only stood because invisible people held up its foundations. People like Miguel, people who scrubbed the floors, fixed the systems, worked in the shadows so others could shine in the light. She had spent years ignoring that truth, believing success was individual, that leaders built empires alone. But they didn't. They never did. "You saved my company," Aurora said, her voice breaking for the first time in weeks. "You saved everything. And I didn't even know your full name until now." Miguel gave a weary smile. "Miguel Lira. Pleasure to finally introduce myself properly." Aurora extended her hand. He hesitated, glanced at his grease-stained, ink-smeared fingers, then took it. And in that handshake, in the cold, dim basement of the obsidian tower, an alliance was forged that would change everything. "You have a daughter, right?" Aurora asked, recalling something Camilla had mentioned once. "I do, Leah. 9 years old. Sick. Needs treatment that costs more than I'll make in 10 lifetimes." Aurora looked at Camilla. Camilla nodded, understanding immediately. "Not anymore," Aurora said, rising and offering her hand to help him up. "Navarro Capital has a medical assistance fund for employees and dependents, and as of now, you're officially one of our most valuable employees. Senior Risk and Security Analyst. Effective immediately, with full medical coverage." Miguel stood frozen, struggling to process what he'd just heard. I don't understand." "You will," Aurora said, smiling. For the first time in weeks, a real smile. "Now come with me, because you're going to witness the end of this story, and I want you there when I finish those bastards upstairs." They returned to the boardroom, Aurora leading, Camila behind, Miguel in the middle, still reeling from how his life had just changed in 15 minutes. When the doors opened, every head turned. Cesar frowned at the sight of the janitor. Ottavio looked bewildered. The board members whispered among themselves. "Gentlemen," Aurora announced, striding to the head of the table with a confidence that electrified the room. "I'd like to introduce Miguel Lira, our new Senior Risk and Security Analyst, and the man who, exactly 10 minutes ago, stopped a cyber attack program to destroy this company." Silence. Utter silence. Cesar went pale. Ottavio tried to stay composed, but his eyes betrayed panic. "What?" Cesar sputtered, trying to sound indignant. "Aurora, what kind of ridiculous accusation is this?" "It's not an accusation," Aurora replied, her tone like ice. "It's a fact. The Cerberus protocol you were so eager for me to sign wasn't just a merger. It was a weapon, a destructive algorithm set to detonate the moment the addendum was approved. The goal? Cripple our systems, trigger an internal collapse, tank our stock, and let you buy everything for pennies on the dollar. This isn't a merger, Cesar. It's a heist." The room erupted in murmurs. Cesar tried to speak, but Aurora raised a hand, silencing everyone. "And you, Ottavio," she turned to the man who'd been like an uncle to her. "You didn't just enable this, you sold confidential data, transferred classified documents, and received €2 million in a Zurich account. We have the logs, the transfers, the timestamps, the witnesses. Ottavio opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then he broke, because there were no lies left to hide behind, no performance left to maintain. The truth had arrived, and it did not forgive. Aurora looked at Miguel, the silent witness to the storm he'd helped unleash, and thought, the invisible have always carried the empires of the visible. Now, finally, everyone knew it. The clock on the boardroom wall read 3:45 p.m. 15 minutes. Only 15 minutes since Aurora dropped the bomb that turned a board meeting into an improvised courtroom. And in those 15 minutes, the world flipped upside down. Cesar Varela was no longer the confident predator who'd strutted into the room. He stood braced over the table, knuckles white with tension, scrambling to build a defense out of words that sounded hollower by the second. "This is a ridiculous narrative spun by a desperate CEO," he barked, jabbing a finger at Aurora with that particular aggression powerful men reach for when the floor starts vanishing under their feet. "You're really going to buy this cyber attack story? Where's the proof? Where are the independent experts? This is a setup." Beatrice Salles, who had slipped into the room quietly amid the chaos, adjusted her red frames and raised a slim folder. "The proof is right here, Cesar. Time-stamped system logs, a forensic analysis signed by 3 independent security firms, and, my favorite, the bank transfers from your Cayman offshore to Ottavio Brandõ's personal account. Would you like me to read the amounts out loud, or would you prefer to hang on to a shred of dignity?" The room went dead silent. Cesar's eyes darted to Ottavio, looking for support, complicity, anything. But Ottavio was shattered, slumped in his chair like a rag doll, hands trembling, face ashen. I only wanted what was mine by right," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. 15 years. 15 years building all this. And she just inherited it. It wasn't fair. Something cracked inside Aurora when she heard that. Not anger. A deeper disappointment. The kind that comes when you learn someone you loved never really loved you back. "Security," Aurora said, her voice steady despite the emotional undertow. "Please escort Mr. Brandão and Mr. Varela out of the building, and call the police. We have charges to file: corporate fraud, market manipulation, and digital sabotage." That was when Cesar finally lost it. He took a step toward Aurora, face flushed with rage, and for a second it looked like he might do something stupid. But Miguel moved, not aggressively, not theatrically. He simply positioned himself between Cesar and Aurora, a silent human shield. And there was something in that simple gesture, in that calm presence of a man with nothing to lose and everything to protect, that made Cesar step back. "This isn't over," Cesar hissed, pointing at Aurora as security entered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will destroy you. I will destroy your company. I will destroy your name." Aurora met his gaze, her voice forged in steel. "You already tried, Cesar, and you failed. Now get out of my building before I add making threats to the list of charges." The guards escorted Cesar and Ottavio away. Cesar fought the whole way out, protesting, threatening lawsuits. Ottavio went quietly, head down, defeated. When the doors finally closed, the room erupted into overlapping conversations. Board members spoke over one another, some shocked, some outraged, others clearly impressed by what they had just witnessed. Aurora let the chaos run for a few seconds, then rapped the table once, hard enough to command the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice controlled, "I understand what just happened is unprecedented, but we have to move fast. The market closes in under an hour. We need to issue an official statement, activate our legal teams, notify the police, and prepare a damage control strategy for when this story leaks, and it will leak." One of the older board members, a man named Augusto Ferreira with snow-white hair and a voice from another era, raised his hand. "Aurora, with all due respect, You've just exposed two of the most powerful men in the financial market. There will be reprisals. Cesar Varela has political connections, media influence, and unlimited resources for a legal war. Are you certain you're ready for that? Aurora looked at Miguel, still standing there beside her, an unlikely, steadying presence. Then she turned back to Augusto. No, Mr. Ferreira, I'm not certain, but I know the alternative was to let them destroy everything my father built, and that I could not allow. A respectful silence followed. Augusto nodded slowly, something like approval in his eyes. Your father would be proud. The words hit Aurora like a wave. She didn't cry. Not there, not in front of the board, but her eyes burned. Thank you, she murmured. Now, let's work. Camilla, bring in legal and communications. Beatrice, prepare the documentation for the police and authorities. Miguel. She turned to him, realizing she still didn't know exactly what his role was now. Miguel, I need you to document everything that happened technically. Every detail of the attack, every line of code, every piece of digital evidence. Can you do that? Miguel nodded. I can, but it'll take a few hours, and I need to make a phone call first. Aurora frowned, curious. To whom? My daughter. To tell her her dad finally got something right. As the Obsidian Tower morphed into a hive of lawyers, auditors, and crisis strategists, the literal storm outside gathered strength. Rain hammered the windows with a force that felt prophetic, as if the city itself were reacting to the drama unfolding inside that glass and steel monolith. Gail found a quiet corner on the 23rd floor, ironically the same hallway he cleaned every night, and called Leah's grandmother, who watched her during the day. Hi, Dona Celia, it's Miguel. Is Leah there? She is, dear. She's drawing. Want to talk to her? I do. There was the sound of a phone changing hands. Then Leah's voice filled the line, bright and high and alive, the sound that always tightened Miguel's chest. Hi, Dad. Are you coming home? I'll be a little late today, Princess, but I called to tell you something important. What? Miguel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the impossible day. Remember when I told you sometimes we have to do the right thing even when it's hard? I remember. Well, today I did the right thing, and because of that, you'll be able to start the treatment, the one the doctors talked about, the one that's going to make you better. Silence on the other end. Then Leah asked, with that strange wisdom kids sometimes have, Did you do something dangerous, Dad? Miguel smiled, eyes wet. I did. But it was worth it. It's always worth it when it's for you. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Princess. More than anything. When he hung up, Miguel stood there for a few minutes, watching the rain, absorbing the fact that his life had changed completely in a matter of hours. He was no longer invisible, no longer just the janitor no one noticed. He was Miguel Lira again, and this time he wasn't going to waste his second chance. At 5:30 p.m., when the market finally closed, Navarro Capital released an official statement. The merger with the Varela Group had been canceled due to strategic incompatibilities identified during internal audit. It was corporate boilerplate, the kind of phrasing that said nothing but told everything to anyone who knew how to read between the lines. Within 40 minutes, every major business outlet had the story. Within an hour, speculation flooded social media. Within 2 hours, Cesar Varela was under investigation by the police and authorities. The machine was in motion, and Aurora knew the worst was still ahead. Because exposing powerful men isn't the end of the story. It's the start of retaliation. Cesar had money, influence, and a wounded ego. He would strike back. He'd use every connection, every favor, every weapon in the corporate arsenal to try to destroy her. But Aurora wasn't afraid anymore. Because now she had something she didn't have before. Clarity. She knew who her enemies were. She knew who her allies were. And she knew, finally, that leadership isn't about looking invincible. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable and strong at the same time. She looked out her office window at the rain-soaked city below and thought, the road back is always harder than the road out. Because coming back means carrying everything you learned, everything you lost, everything you gained. And the weight of that baggage changes you forever. Hell arrived on a Monday. Of course it did. The universe has a cruel sense of humor like that. Aurora woke at 5 a.m. to her phone erupting with notifications. 17 missed calls, 43 messages. And when she finally unlocked the screen, she saw the headline that confirmed her worst fears. Navarro Capital CEO accused of fabricating evidence to sabotage billion-dollar merger. The article was published by one of the country's biggest financial outlets, written by a columnist known for being, let's say, friendly with Cesar Varela. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. It painted Aurora as a paranoid, vindictive executive who had invented a non-existent cyber attack to justify canceling a merger she was too incompetent to manage. It cited sources close to the negotiation, obviously Cesar and his lawyers, claiming the accusations were baseless, that there was no evidence of a malicious algorithm, that it was all corporate theater. And the worst part, it suggested Aurora was using the police investigation as a smokescreen to hide internal management failures. It was pure venom, distilled, lethal, and it was working. When Aurora arrived at the Obsidian Tower at 6:30, an hour and a half earlier than usual, because sleep had become impossible, she found Camilla already in her office, surrounded by laptops, phones, and that expression of sleepless crisis management. "How bad?" Aurora asked, tossing her bag onto the chair. Camilla didn't even look up. 3 investment funds requested emergency meetings. 2 board members threatened to resign. And we've got 7 defamation suits incoming, courtesy of Caesar's lawyers. Oh, and the market hasn't even opened yet. But projections say our stock will drop at least 15% in the first hour. Aurora sank into her chair. "So we're in the eye of the storm." "No," corrected Beatrice, entering the room with 3 espresso cups and the face of someone who'd seen worse. "We are the storm, and storms don't stop. They tear through everything until they burn out. The question is, do you still have enough fuel to finish this?" The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9. But at 8:40, something unexpected happened. Miguel Lira walked into Aurora's office, not as a janitor, but as the senior analyst he now officially was, wearing a simple dress shirt Camilla had bought him over the weekend. He carried a flash drive and an expression of hard resolve. "I have something you need to see," he said flatly. Before the meeting, before anything. He plugged in the drive and opened a series of files, system logs, endless lines of code, digital hieroglyphs to most people. But Miguel translated them with the ease of a man who spoke the language of machines. Cerberus wasn't just a destructive algorithm, he explained, his voice taking on that crisp cadence of someone in their element. It was a masterpiece of malicious engineering. Look here, it was programmed to activate in 3 stages. First, corrupt backups. Second, create ghost transactions to mimic accounting irregularities. Third, leak falsified financial data to the media exactly when the market was most vulnerable. And look at the timestamp for the 3rd stage. He paused, letting Aurora process. She read the code line, and her stomach turned. Today, at 9:15. Exactly, Miguel confirmed. 15 minutes after the market opens, the perfect time to cause maximum panic. Cesar didn't stop. Aurora. The attack I neutralized on Friday was just round 1. He had a plan B. And that plan goes live in, he checked the clock, 28 minutes. The silence that followed was suffocating. Camilla dropped her phone. Beatrice removed her glasses, rubbing tired eyes. Aurora felt that familiar edge, the cliff where she had to decide whether to retreat or jump. "Can you stop it?" she asked Miguel, already knowing she was asking the impossible. "I can, but not alone, and not from here. The code's hosted on external servers, probably the same ones in Zurich we flagged before. To stop it, I have to get into their network, which means hack," Beatrice finished for him, blunt as ever. "You'd be committing a federal crime, even if it's for defense." Miguel nodded. "Exactly. If I do this, I can stop the attack, but I'll also burn my career. Permanently. I'll never work in this field again, and I'll probably get arrested." Aurora looked at him. This invisible janitor turned improbable hero who had already saved her company once and was ready to risk everything again. She thought of what he stood to lose, his daughter, her treatment, the second chance that had barely begun. Then she thought of everyone who depended on Navarro Capital, the employees, the families, the retirees whose pensions were tied to the company's stability. "No," she said firmly. "You're not doing this alone. We're doing it, and if it goes to hell, I'll take the blame." Miguel started to protest, but she raised a hand to silence him. "Listen, you've already risked enough, lost enough. I won't let you burn your second chance because of my failures, so here's what's going to happen. You'll teach me exactly what to do, step by step, and I'll execute. If it works, we save the company. If it doesn't, I take the fall. Deal." Miguel searched her face for hesitation, for fear, for doubt, but found only resolve. And for the first time since he'd walked into that building 5 years ago as a ghost in a janitor's uniform, Miguel Lira smiled. "Deal, but you'll have to type fast, and not be afraid to break a few federal laws." The next 23 minutes were the most intense of Aurora Navarro's life. Miguel sat beside her, guiding every keystroke, every command, every digital incursion as they infiltrated, yes, infiltrated, the external servers hosting Cerberus's second stage. Camilla locked the door, standing guard. Beatrice, pragmatic as ever, began drafting a preemptive legal defense just in case, and Aurora typed, and typed, and typed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her heart pounding so hard she could hear the blood rush in her ears. "Now run the root command," Miguel instructed, pointing at the screen. "It'll throw an error, ignore it, try again with sudo." "That's Greek to me," Aurora muttered, but obeyed. "Welcome to my world," Miguel said with a tense smile. "Now look for the master deploy file. It'll be hidden inside a folder called Backup Legacy. No one ever checks backup directories." Aurora navigated through the digital labyrinth, searching, scrolling, scanning, and then found it. "Perfect. Now easy does it. You're going to delete that file, but first, you need to corrupt the checksum. Otherwise, the system will auto-restore. Type this command." Miguel dictated a string of symbols and numbers that looked like something out of a spellbook. Aurora took a breath, typed, and hit enter. The screen flickered, froze for 2 agonizing seconds. Then, operation completed successfully. Miguel exhaled. It worked. The second stage is neutralized. It won't launch. Aurora looked at the clock, 9:14. 1 minute before detonation, she'd just saved the company. Again. But this time, she hadn't just led. She'd fought. She'd crossed lines, broken rules, and become not just the CEO who inherited an empire, but the warrior who earned the right to defend it. At 9:15, when the market opened, Navarro Capital's stock plunged 12% in the first 5 minutes, exactly as predicted. But then something unexpected happened. It stabilized. Then it climbed. Because while Cesar Varela waited for chaos to shatter the company's credibility, Aurora Navarro was standing in the boardroom, live before the cameras of an emergency press conference, presenting irrefutable evidence of the sabotage, not the complex digital forensics. Those were too technical for the public. She showed the bank transfers, the encrypted emails, the signed contracts, and the killing blow, a security video of Otavio Brandão at 3 a.m. on a Thursday, accessing restricted servers and copying confidential files to a flash drive. "This is not corporate paranoia," Aurora declared, looking straight into the cameras, into the eyes of an entire nation. "This is calculated sabotage. And we didn't just survive, we won." The market reacted. Within 30 minutes, the stock rebounded to its previous level. Within an hour, it was up 8%. And by the time the market closed, Navarro Capital had recorded its highest trading volume of the quarter. Cesar Varela, watching from his private office, tasted, for the first time in decades, the bitter flavor of complete defeat. And Aurora Navarro, standing on the 42nd floor, looking out at the city that carried on below, indifferent to human dramas, finally understood what resurrection meant. It wasn't about becoming who you were before. It was about becoming who you needed to be to survive what you'd been through. She had walked through hell, and she had come out the other side not just alive, but transformed, forged, unbreakable. 3 months later, the obsidian tower didn't look much different from the outside. It was still that colossus of glass and steel anchored in the city's financial heart, still glowing at night with that cool, distant light only money can buy. But inside, everything had changed, subtly, profoundly, irreversibly. It was as if the building had weathered an invisible storm and emerged with its structure intact, but its soul transformed. Aurora now arrived at work at 8 a.m. Not 6, no longer carrying that suffocating weight of believing that stopping meant failing. She had learned, in the hardest way possible, that leadership isn't about always being there. It's about being there when it matters. And she learned something even more important. Empires aren't built by one person alone, but by hundreds of invisible people who choose, every day, to hold up the foundations. Cesar Varela and Otavio Brandão were facing 7 different lawsuits, 3 criminal, 4 civil. The investigations uncovered a web of corruption far beyond Navarro capital: shell companies, offshore accounts in tax havens, bribes to auditors, systematic market manipulation. The scandal shook the entire financial system, forcing regulatory changes and creating legal precedent that law schools would study for years. Cesar lost everything. The company, the reputation, and his freedom was restricted while awaiting trial. Otavio, broken and remorseful, cut a plea deal and began cooperating with authorities. Sometimes Aurora thought of him, the man who had been almost an uncle, and felt a heavy sadness, not anger, not hatred. Just the melancholy of understanding that people are complicated, motives are murky, and betrayal often says more about inner pain than pure malice. Navarro Capital had reorganized from the ground up. The board now included independent members and specialists in compliance and corporate governance. Aurora created a new division, ethics and transparency in investments, and put someone unexpected in charge: Miguel Lira. He pushed back at first. "I'm a systems analyst, not a corporate ethics guru," he protested. But Aurora was insistent. "You understand something most executives don't. Systems are made of people, and failures are never technical. They're always human. I need someone who sees patterns where others see only numbers." Reluctant but intrigued, Miguel accepted. 3 months later, he'd implemented internal audit protocols considered revolutionary in the market. He built an anonymous whistleblowing system that protected informants. He established quarterly reviews where any employee, from intern to director, could question strategic decisions without fear of retaliation. And more importantly, he began changing the culture. Slowly, patiently, he was teaching a billion-dollar company to value transparency as much as profit. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, but it was working. And Miguel, who had spent 5 years invisible, was now regularly interviewed by trade publications, invited to speak, cited as a model of a successful second chance. He hated the attention, but loved the work. That made all the difference. Leah started the experimental treatment 2 weeks after that impossible day. The procedure was brutal. Sessions of genetic chemo that left the girl exhausted, nauseated, fragile as a bird. There were nights Miguel stayed awake at the hospital, holding her hand, sure he was going to lose her. There were moments when he doubted everything, the choices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the cosmic fairness of saving a company while his daughter suffered. But Leah was strong, stronger than him, stronger than any adult had a right to be. And slowly, miraculously, the treatment began to work. The tremors subsided, her coordination improved, the color returned to her face. And on a sunny October morning, The doctor walked in with that careful smile health professionals wear when they have good news, but refuse to overpromise. Her genetic markers are stabilizing, he said, showing charts Miguel could barely read through his tears. She's responding beyond expectations. It's not a cure, and we can't use that word yet. But it's remission. It's a chance. It's a future. Miguel fell apart, right there in the hospital corridor, under flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant seeping into everything. He crumpled. He cried like he hadn't since the day he lost everything in the market. But these tears were different. They were gratitude, relief, hope regained. And when Leah came out of the room limping but smiling, those big brown eyes shining with life, Miguel understood the true elixir of this journey. It wasn't professional success, recognition, or money. It was this 9-year-old girl who called him dad and believed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he could do anything. Aurora had her own elixir too. On a Friday afternoon, after a particularly intense week of meetings and negotiations, she did something she hadn't done in years. She took the weekend off. For real. No laptop, no work phone, no, just a quick check-in disguised as a remote meeting. She got in the car, drove herself, something else she hadn't done in years, and headed to Porto das Areias, a small coastal town 3 hours from the capital that her father loved. He used to take her there when she was a child, before the empire consumed all the time, all the energy, all the life. Aurora rented a simple seaside cottage with a wooden porch and a hammock swaying in the salty breeze, and she spent 2 days doing absolutely nothing. She woke when her body wanted, ate when she was hungry, walked the beach with no destination, no hurry, no agenda. And there, barefoot in the wet sand with the sun sinking into an impossible gradient of oranges and pinks, Aurora finally let the armor drop. She allowed herself to feel the stored-up exhaustion, the sorrow of Otavio's betrayal, the loneliness of steering an empire alone, but also the gratitude for the team that stayed loyal, for Beatrice and Camilla, who fought by her side when it would have been easier to abandon ship, and for Miguel, the invisible janitor who had seen not just the CEO in her, but the person. She picked up her personal phone, the one only family and close friends had, and texted Miguel, "Thank you for everything. You taught me that leadership isn't about always being right. It's about being willing to listen to those brave enough to tell the truth." The reply came 5 minutes later. "Thank you for making me visible again, and for reminding me that second chances exist, but only for those brave enough to earn them." When Aurora returned to the capital Sunday night, she wasn't the same woman who'd left. The elixir she carried back wasn't tangible, not a signed document, not a number in a quarterly report. It was something subtler and more powerful, wisdom, a deep understanding that true leadership isn't about commanding from the top of an ivory tower, but about going down to the basement and recognizing that every empire is held up by people you've never met. It was about vulnerability, about admitting you don't know everything, that you need help, that strength isn't never falling. It's getting back up after you do. On Monday morning, Aurora arrived at the Obsidian Tower at 8 sharp and did something no CEO had ever done in the company's history. She asked to gather all employees, not just executives, but everyone, from analysts to cleaning staff, security, and reception. It took 3 sessions because the auditorium couldn't fit everyone at once. In each session, Aurora stepped on stage with no slides, no teleprompter, no rehearsed script, and she spoke. She talked about the last few months, about the storm they'd weathered, about the mistakes she'd made by believing leadership meant always being in control, always invincible, always right. "I learned," she said, her voice echoing across the quiet auditorium, "that a company isn't made of numbers on spreadsheets. It's made of people, and every person here, every single one, has something to teach me if I'm humble enough to listen. So here's my promise. My office door will always be open. Not metaphorically, literally open. And if you see something wrong, spot a flaw, or have an idea that can make us better, I want to hear it. Because if this crisis taught me anything, it's that salvation never comes from the top. It comes from the bottom, from the invisible people who've always been holding up the ceiling so we could breathe. The silence that followed was profound. Then someone started clapping. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, not because it was expected, but because it was genuine. 6 months after that impossible day when everything nearly collapsed, Navarro Capital announced the best quarterly results in its history. Not because they'd doubled down on aggressive strategies or risky speculation, but because they'd invested in sustainability, transparency, and ethics. And the market, cynical and pragmatic as ever, rewarded it. Because at the end of the day, investors want returns, but they want security even more, and Navarro Capital had become synonymous with both. Miguel was promoted to Vice President of Innovation and Compliance, a role created specifically for him, recognizing that his vision went far beyond systems and algorithms. Leah was in full remission, back in school, taking ballet, directing little plays with her friends, and Miguel, for the first time in years, allowed himself to dream about the future. Not just survival, a future. Aurora remained CEO, but a different one. More human, more connected, more aware that power isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions. And one ordinary afternoon, when she passed Miguel in the hallway, he leaving a meeting, she heading to another, they shared a simple nod. No longer the vast distance between Billionaire CEO and invisible janitor. Just two survivors who had walked through hell together and come out the other side, transformed. The elixir they brought back from the journey wasn't in titles, bank accounts, or newspaper headlines. It lived in something far simpler and infinitely more valuable. They had learned to see beyond appearances, beyond titles. To see the humanity in every person, no matter where they stood in the invisible hierarchies we build to feel important. And the obsidian tower, that colossus of glass and steel, still stood. But now, finally, it had a soul. Because empires aren't built by perfect people. They're built by people brave enough to admit their flaws, learn from them, and keep going. Together. Always together.